Good morning and welcome to the Atlantic Council, to today's discussion on the Libra, balancing risks and opportunities. There are three panelists. I'm only one of them. Bart Osterfeld, who runs the Economic and Business Initiative, and with me, the Sanctions Initiative at the Atlantic Council, is going to run the discussion. This discussion turns out to be even better timed than we had hoped. Fed Chairman Jerome Powell spoke about, in his testimony, mentioned the Libra. Next week, there are hearings on the Libra. Yesterday, David Marcus, the head of Calibra, the Facebook subsidiary who's going to be running the wallet function for the Libra, is going to be testifying at Senate Banking Committee and House Financial Services Committee. Yesterday, he sent a response to the Senate Banking Committee responding to the letter back in May, which was asked a number of skeptical questions about the Libra. There are a number of ways to approach the issue. Jen Fowler, in particular, has expertise of which I am still in awe in the regulatory and FATF worlds. Barbara Matthews was a Treasury attaché in Brussels and knows the financial world from close up on the ground. I've been working on sanctions issues for a number of years with Jen Fowler at Treasury. So I'm looking forward to a lively discussion and tough, insightful questions. And I think, Bart, it's up to you to get us started.
Well, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining this Economic Sanctions Initiative event. Ambassador Fried has highlighted the expertise of the panel, and I wanted to emphasize that as well, that we have a great panel in terms of tackling the regulatory risks, other risks, the opportunities potentially for financial inclusion and other areas of this new cryptocurrency or payment platform. I would be remiss if I didn't mention that we're also missing some people on the panel, and that wanted to highlight for the audience that it's not for lack of trying. Nobody associated with the Libra Association, none of the companies or the association itself has chosen to send representatives. That wasn't because we didn't invite them. So they've chosen not to come speak in public on the record about this initiative. The panelists, a quick reintroduction, especially of Ambassador Dan Fried. He's a distinguished fellow here at the Atlantic Council, served as sanctions coordinator at the State Department, among other high-profile positions over a distinguished career at the State Department, including ambassador to Poland and National Security Council director under the Clinton and Bush administrations. Jen Fowler, to my immediate left, is a director at the Brunswick Group here in Washington, D.C., served for almost 20 years at Treasury, and held the Deputy Assistant Secretary position for counterterrorist financing, among other positions, and also served as Vice President for the Financial Action Task Force. And then, last but not least, Barbara Matthews, all the way on the left, is a fellow in the Global Business and Economics program here at the Atlantic Council. Served as the first Treasury Department attaché to the European Union about 10, 15 years ago. And before that, served as Banking and Regulatory Counsel at the International Institute of Finance. So let's talk about a number of broad topics. So I'd like to tackle regulation, enforcement of the kind of things the Financial Action Task Force is concerned with, sanctions and sanctions evasion. This is not the first cryptocurrency that has been discussed in terms of a way to find your way around U.S. sanctions potentially. And then risks to things like financial stability and the conduct of orderly monetary policy by the world's central banks. Perhaps Jen, let me start with you. If you would like to make some opening comments about risks and opportunities presented by this currency.
So for me, I think the announcement of this initiative is sort of put a spotlight, but maybe a greater spotlight on lots of things that were already happening in the regulatory space. It's been a really intense period of work, I think, done at the Treasury Department in the U.S. and at the Financial Action Task Force to really try to set a landscape for regulation around cryptocurrency. And it's really remarkable. I think, when I was at Treasury and then I've been away for about a year, regulators and other governments involved in trying to figure out the right way to regulate cryptocurrency really struggled, I think, to figure out what the right balance is between innovation, which governments want to encourage, and how to prevent misuse, like you do for any financial product or payment system. And then you look at what's happened in the last year, and I feel like we really now have a pretty clear regulatory landscape set. And one of the big things that happened was that the FATF has issued new guidance and interpretive notes and really done, I think, incredibly good and solid work in the last year to really set that landscape and be very clear about what the expectations are. FATF had done work previously, but what's happened, I think, is really an acceleration in the last year, and I have to give them, really a lot of credit, because having worked in FATF for many years, it's a body that has, more than 30 members. It's hard to come to conclusion and consensus around an approach, particularly for something as emerging and interesting and sort of challenging as cryptocurrencies that don't really look like other things that FATF has dealt with in the past. So, a lot of credit to FATF to coming to a conclusion this year on what approach and what the expectations are. But it's pretty tough. They're pretty high standards and pretty tough expectations that they've laid out. But that landscape is now set. And so that the spotlight really is on that. And now the question is, how will governments react to that, implement it, and how will cryptocurrency wallets and other actors in the space really adapt to what the expectations are from a regulatory perspective? I think a few years ago you also had very few countries actually regulating cryptocurrency, which was a real concern for the United States. They felt like the real risk was the uneven regulation around the world, and slowly but surely you see, I think, governments have regulations coming into place in the EU. You have now you have these FATF expectations that will be assessed after a year, FATF said, which is very unique for FATF. They usually take many years to sort of assess implementation, and they've said we're going to do this on an accelerated basis. So, within a year they're going to look at that again, how countries are implementing. So you have, I think, now this a real sort of trend toward improving and really establishing the regulation that puts cryptocurrency in the same landscape as other financial institutions and service providers. You have to say that's not, I think, what the cryptocurrency industry sector had argued for. Some had and some were concerned about it. But I think Treasury and others have been very clear, no, we want to have this at the same level from a regulatory perspective as the expectations we have for other financial institutions. And so there's some key elements in FATF's guidance that I think were controversial, particularly with the sector, that are now in place. And that's going to raise a lot of questions for how to comply. We can talk more about risks. I think, from my perspective on cryptocurrency, it's anytime you have opacity or the potential for opacity in the financial system, there's a risk, and that's true for financial institutions, banks, remitters, just like it is for cryptocurrency. So there's some context there about risk that I think everyone should keep in mind when you think about risk and landscape and really what the AML CFT risks are in particular.
Thank you, Jennifer. Dan, you and I had a conversation in the office yesterday after we digested the white paper of the association. Your opening comments, perhaps, with that conversation in mind.
Okay. I recommend that everybody read the Libra white paper describing what they have in mind. It makes a strong case for using modern 21st century internet technology to extend banking to the unbanked, people who don't have access to the international financial system. That is a strong argument, and I remember the initial enthusiasm around the world when cell phones allowed people to circumvent the heavy, inefficient, incomplete, often state-run telephone networks in their countries. This is a generation ago. This is the early 90s. So there's an argument to be made. But the language of the white paper goes a lot farther than that. It refers to a global, open, instant, and low-cost movement of money, decentralized forms of governance, and a global currency and financial infrastructure. Now that is sweeping language which in its sort of post-national utopian vision reminds me of nothing so much as social media's initial arguments that the globalization of social media would be a massive democratizing event, creating global communities and driving out the bad with the good. Now, I've spent a lot of time working on disinformation, and we know it didn't turn out quite that way. It turns out that the digital world requires some kind of regulation to keep it from being taken over by bad actors. Now, this is not to say that the information space and financial regulation are at all the same, because they're not. But the principle of a post-national utopia, which may appear appealing from Silicon Valley, may not work. I mean, to recall a phrase that's 100 years old, you may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you. You sitting in the Bay Area may not think that the nation state or bad actors are still out there, but they are, and they will take advantage of the system. Which means, it doesn't mean that the Libra can't work. I mean, Jen Fowler has enormous experience in helping the international financial system catch up to and control and limit, circumscribe bad financial actors. So it's possible to make it work. But this conversation is just beginning, and the white paper doesn't delve deeply into those issues at all. I mean, it describes in very general terms the structure of the Libra. It's going to use blockchain technology. It's going to be backed. It's not going to be free floating. It's not like other cryptocurrencies. It's going to be backed by a basket of currencies. It'll be governed by an independent Libra association, which is a consortium of corporations and headquartered in Switzerland. Yesterday, David Marcus, who's heading Calibra, which is going to run the Libra wallet function, basically the equivalent of the personal the personal account system for everybody who wants to use the Libra, said, "We want and need government, central banks, regulators, nonprofits, and other stakeholders at the table and value all of the feedback we have received." Well, inclusiveness is good, but I don't know that regulators in the United States or Brussels will be satisfied with simply being invited to be at somebody else's table. Jerome Powell yesterday said Libra raises many serious concerns regarding privacy, money laundering, consumer protection, and financial stability. The Europeans have expressed some skepticism, and of course in Europe, particularly in France, there is a certain political incentive to go after American giants, so we should understand that. India hates digital currencies generally and is blocked it. I mean, the Libra, all digital currencies. China, I think earlier this week, suggested, well, if American companies are going to launch their ambitious global cryptocurrency, China ought to do the same. And if you want to see, Professor Joseph Stiglitz is not known for underwriting. You may want to look at his article, which goes after the Libra. It's hot. I suspect the next week's hearings will be similarly hot. That doesn't mean the Libra can't be made to work. And I agree with what Jen Fowler was saying. And I would add that we're at the beginning of a regulatory process. I am not a financial expert the way my panel colleagues are. But the question I had after reading the white paper, other than a deep skepticism about technologically driven utopias, because this is not the first one, they all end up incomplete or badly. But other than that, the question is the Libra a massive, at-scale, international payment system, or is it something else? Currency baskets aren't that new. SDR has been around since, for a generation or more than a generation. It's been around a long time. So what is it when you take, if we drain away the utopianism of this post-national paradise, what is this thing in itself? Can it do good? Can it be regulated? What does the business model mean? And hopefully the discussions here, next week in Congress, but I think subsequently can tease out the question, what is the Libra actually, and whether it can accomplish some of the things that its backers say is their intention. So that's just by way of, large issue framing. And again, I'm going to defer to both of my colleagues who know this space far more than I do.
Thank you, Dan. That wasn't provocative at all. Barbara, let me turn to you. Temptation is to talk, obviously, about legal aspects, regulatory aspects. So what would be your opening comments from that angle?
So I've got two very significant comments. The first I want to react and support some of what Ambassador Freed just said. I am reminded and tend to agree with Madison's statement in Federalist 51 that if people were angels, we wouldn't need government. And if government were run by angels, I'm paraphrasing, of course, if government were run by angels, we wouldn't need checks and balances. So I think there's a balance to be struck there. It is true that Libra is not the first cryptocurrency to be launched by a major organization. I mean, earlier, and Jen is absolutely right, the policy community is not exactly in a defensive crouch. They've been preparing for this for quite some time. Not only has FATF been doing quite a lot of work in this area, on the private sector side, JP Morgan launched its own coin, which is pegged entirely to the US dollar, which raised some hackles in a lot of places. The currency basket itself, has been around since the post-war period. Central banks, the BIS has released research throughout this year, building all the way up to the G20 summit in June. Central banks are launching their own, experimenting with how they might launch their own central bank digital currencies. The way that I see it, that there's a very significant and appropriate competition underway. What is new about Libra is that the company and the companies participating in the project are not technically banks. And that is a component of the proposal and the project that I think have been underappreciated. There is a long history that goes back throughout this early century associated with regulating money service businesses and expanding the regulatory and terrorism finance protection system into money service businesses, transfer mechanisms, payment systems. And that's one issue that we could go miles deep in, but that's a long-standing challenge. You know, when I worked in the Congress for the Financial Services Committee, and I worked on the legislation that extended the regulatory and oversight perimeter to money service businesses after September 11. Many of the financial inclusion, economic development, and kind of the angel side of the debate were front and center, but part of what government does also is to protect public safety and the public interest in safety of not being having financial systems subject to abuse or worse from bad actors won out. Separately, launching a currency, having it be recognized as legal tender and used in transactions from small value transactions as they are in Japan in certain convenience stores, all the way up to high value transactions as will be used with the JP Morgan coin in the wholesale payment system. Much of that argument is as much about instant payments, not having the intermediary take the credit risk, an instant payment. Europeans, through the European Central Bank, have already begun to launch an instant payment mechanism with the euro. And in yesterday's appearance by Chairman Powell made clear that the United States won't be launching an instant payment system in 2020. And there is no clear vision as to when the United States might launch instant payments with the US dollar as the center. So the way that I see it, and this is the second big point, the rhetoric is all very much about sovereignty, and we could have a really interesting discussion about that. But I think that it's useful to take the sovereignty issue to one side and then look at the details, because the details are that the private sector and a lot of individuals who, in our Western system of governments, are the owners of sovereignty. We only delegate that sovereignty to governments for specific purposes. Individuals are voting with their feet, and they're giving governments and central banks competition for the first time in multiple generations. I tend to like competition. I think it makes us all better. But I don't like competition that puts at risk the safety of individuals. And that's where I think FATF does a really good job in bringing together the global community and saying, well, that there's a public interest here, and there are bad actors that should not be using the system and shouldn't be gaming the system.
Thank you. Thank you all. I think we have a lot of topics to explore here. Jennifer, if I could start with you, two questions about scale. First, just taking cryptocurrencies broadly at the moment, you can include this new plan or not. As a matter of risk to things like enforcement of counter-terrorist financing rules and anti-money laundering compliance, how do they rank compared to banks, other payment system? So let me start with that one.
Sure. So I sort of historically, I think the view has been that, so clearly there's, like I said, there's any time you have opacity or the potential for opacity in the financial system, there's a risk there. And we know criminals are going to try to exploit that. That's just sort of how it works. And they're very good at finding the best and most efficient and most effective ways to do what they need to do. But that exists in cryptocurrency. It also exists in banks. It exists in the potential to set up shell companies. It exists in potential to mask your identification, with a money remitter. So there are opportunities throughout the financial system. And I think even in Treasury's most recent risk assessments, which they did last year on money laundering and terrorist financing, they both sort of acknowledge that anecdotally on terrorist financing, you see terrorists try to use cryptocurrency, but it doesn't rank as the highest and most preferred form of sort of method of financing. And that is consistent with what, I think the thinking was when I was there. But regulators are right, I think, to raise alarms about, well, there's a potential there, and how do we then put the right things in place to prevent it? Money laundering, Treasury was clear, I think, in their risk assessment that, there's drug payments are, that is part of, there are established sort of incidents of people using cryptocurrency for drug payments. But again, when you look at the scale of money laundering, and I think the estimate is sort of like 300 billion criminal proceeds every year sort of that need to be laundered in the United States. And the estimate, I think, on cryptocurrency being used for money laundering is about 1.2 billion. Now that's a lot of money. And that's over the last couple of years, and that will change, and that can change. But I really think there's some context around how much money, regulators have to cope with, and that's flowing in the financial system that's potentially criminal proceeds, and where is it placed and laundered. And there's an opportunity, of course, with cryptocurrency, but there's also opportunities with, more traditional forms of payment. So the question here is how best to prevent it, and that's not a perfect. There's no perfect system for that, but what are the right controls? And that's why I think this new FATF sort of guidance is so significant, because it really does get at some of the trickier issues, sort of the originator and beneficiary information, and how do you keep track of that and have that on hand. That's a particularity of cryptocurrency that I think people aren't clear about. And that now is very clear that needs to happen, and it's similar to what's expected of the banking, and the rest of the financial system. So risk is, I think it's everywhere, and you have to keep in mind sort of scale. One of the things that has been true for cryptocurrencies in the past, and again it could change, I guess, is that you saw that money launderers and others aren't necessarily preferring it because there isn't the scalability. There wasn't the stability, and the operability with the fiat system wasn't, efficient like it might be with cash or some other, banking transfer. So that's also something that has been true. We'll see if it remains true, but it's another issue.
Yeah, it brings actually to mind the second question I had on scale and this linkage to the fiat system. So one thing that sets the Libra apart theoretically is this link to a basket of currencies, and the white paper and other research are fairly specific about how that link would be established, and the kind of instruments that the association would invest in. So the short-term deposits, short-term debt of highly rated sovereigns, and links to stable currency. Any comments? If this takes off, so there's 2.4 billion Facebook users, there's 1.7 billion unbanked adults in the world. Let's wave a magic wand, and all these people are suddenly using Libra. Any comments on financial stability, if that's the scope of this enterprise, and or impact on the investment environment?
I don't know if I can. I mean, the stability issues for, I don't know. I can comment on that. I think for me, the question is really again on the money laundering, terrorist financing. What are the sort of gates and controls that are in place, and how does that work?
Okay, thank you. Maybe Barbara, I'm going to ask you the same question, and that'll be the first. And then if I could also ask you, it's more of an aside, but if you could finish your answer with it. We had a brief discussion about how meaningful or not it is that the association chose to locate in Switzerland for regulatory purposes. So if you wouldn't mind talking about that as well. So first the scale question, and then the regulatory. It will be the start of our regulatory discussion. That's an advance warning.
Thank you. So I'm actually really glad that you raised the basket issue, because that tends to not get as much attention as other components. Among other things, and I'm a member of the Bretton Woods Committee, and I have actually read the Bretton Woods transcripts from 1944. So I understand where they were, what they were thinking of when they created the SGR. And at that time, it was backed by gold. And it was very traumatic for the financial system when the United States decided to break with the gold standard in the early 1970s. So my point is that the IMF, which runs the premier currency basket currently in operation, actually is very transparent. Among other things, they publish daily the valuation and the balance. You have to really be dedicated and know where to look for it. But the reality is that they're very transparent about how they compose the basket, what the valuation is. And when the basket expanded recently to include the Chinese currency, there was a whole buildup to that. And it was very transparent how it was happening and when it would occur. The question, the legitimate question, I think, is whether a private association of companies are going to be similarly transparent. And then there are also, there's a phrase, I look a lot at language for a lot of different reasons, and everyone talks about the blockchain, and what they don't talk about in the context of financial stability is the risk of a chain reaction, which I think is important to consider. In a world of instant payments, you can say, okay, it's safe and there's no risk because the algorithm, which by the way, we don't exactly know how it works, but the algorithm is going to automatically ensure instant payments. Well, that's great, but if you look at the history of private issuance of currencies in the United States during the free banking era in the 19th century, there were plenty of chain reactions that occurred with physical paper and physical currency. And how do we know that human behavior won't be replicated in the algorithm? I don't know. If someone has the answer to that question, I would love to know what it is. I personally don't know the answer to that question, so it's something I will be asking. When you talk about financial stability, you also have to talk about international spillover effects because we do live in a global economy, and that's not going away anytime soon. Not only do we live in a globally interconnected economy, but we now have the ability for people to permission use of their data in ways that have never been possible before, except in Switzerland, which has a long tradition of protecting customer confidentiality, somewhat controversially. So in a universe where people have the capacity to permission use of their personal data, and that's habit data, that's banking data, that's identity data, that is a significant paradigm shift that does create challenges for the system of banking oversight and terrorism finance oversight that we have, which is premised on the notion that in certain components of your interactions with the financial system, you don't actually have a right to privacy, within certain boundaries. I think those are going to be very interesting issues. Dan is right. We're just at the front end of really exploring this. While I think some of the sovereignty issues are important, they aren't new. From the collapse of the gold standard and the original Bretton Woods system to today, policymakers have been struggling with the challenge of how to craft standards that respect national sovereignty and yet have some kind of international interoperability. And we've seen that through the history of the Basel Committee, through the history of FATF, through the history of IOSCO in the securities area and the IAIS in the insurance area. These are all informal organizations. None of them are treaty-based. Technically, none of them have legal personality. They cannot enforce the standards they articulate. The issues that we are seeing with a location in Switzerland, I think bring into high relief some of those questions once again. It's the same location as the Bank for International Settlements. It's a location that values customer privacy over almost all other values. And I think we're about to have a very interesting debate on what the boundary is, whether we're talking about minimum standards, which has really been the debate since 1972, or whether we're going to talk about interoperability. There's a trade policy issue there as well. It was stunning to see the G20 spend so much of its communique talking about the digital economy and talking about interoperability and data transfers. They had their eyes focused on the 21st century. They talked about the security issues as well. And those issues don't get as much play because a lot of people run around with a lot of rhetoric about sovereignty and taking on the central government. I'm sorry, but a consortium is a centralized aggregation of authority as well. An algorithm is centralized as well. You may choose how you permission your access within it, but it's still centralized. If we're going to be working together globally, there's got to be some kind of central engagement. How we define the rules around that is going to be really hard. I can't wait to see how it turns out.
Thank you. A follow-up question quickly on let's call it regulatory entry points. Is it you can regulate cryptocurrencies and the blockchain in a whole range of ways. In India, if you're involved in a cryptocurrency, you go to jail for 10 years, so that's one form of regulating. You can regulate it as an asset, as a commodity, as you can regulate it as a network. You can wake up the old telecom and railroad regulators from the 1970s and say, here's a new network, go and the government could use its computing power to force itself into the validation business and mine the currencies. What do you think is the most promising regulatory angle for an innovation like this one? How would you go about attacking this?
Thank you for the easy question. A few takes on that. In the United States, in banking and securities, in securities we have the Howey test. Is it a security? In banking, we've got the National Banking Act. Is it incidental to banking? And over the life of the National Banking Act, the jurisprudence there from the Supreme Court on down has been very elastic in its definition of what is incidental to banking. Just about everything can be defined as incidental to banking, it seems. So it's not so much a jurisdictional issue. I think as it is a cultural paradigm shift. You asked that question as the U.S. government has completed its exit of icon and governance of the internet. I think we live in a distributed age where a government coming in and saying, hi, I'm here from the government, I'm here to help, and I'm going to take this over, and you're only going to operate by my rules, just isn't going to work anymore. I think we're redefining the balance of power between people and governments. And so I think it's important to look at first principles. Why do governments exist to begin with? They exist to protect the public safety. We need places where we feel safe, where we're not going to be taken advantage of by scam artists, by terrorists, if you think more broadly on the roads, companies with building autonomous vehicles, how do we know they're going to be safe? What's the transparency? So thinking about public safety and what does public safety involve, I think is the most useful, helpful place to start, where there will be agreement, because every legitimate operator of a cryptocurrency is certainly not going to get up and say, well, we don't believe in public safety, and we don't believe terrorists should be using our payment system any more than they should be using the FedWire. There are places of commonality where we can agree that certain basic principles of public safety, financial stability are important. And that's a good place, I think, to start the discussion. I don't have the answer for where that discussion leads us.
Dan, I wanted to talk a bit about U.S. sanctions policy compliance. You and I have directed research about things like the Petro, the Venezuelan attempt at circumventing U.S. sanctions it was misguided and then poorly implemented, so it never got off the ground. But U.S. sanctions policy and the fact that in recent years U.S. sanctions policy is usually not well coordinated with allies has other countries such as the EU SPV and the Petro looking for alternatives around the U.S. payment system and ways to evade sanctions. Any comments on the Libra or crypto in general as a risk to the effectiveness of U.S. sanctions policy?
Well, Jen Fowler was right that bad actors are going to use try to use the Libra or any cryptocurrency, and they use all the other payment forms. So there's nothing especially attractive about cryptocurrencies except that they're novel, and the regulatory framework is relatively underdeveloped. Of course, the Libra or any cryptocurrency is going to raise problems of sanctions enforcement, especially since the accounts are supposed to be pseudonymous. That's in the white paper. So I think the Libra consortium, sensitive to issues about privacy and data dumps, has emphasized the confidentiality. Well, that raises compliance issues, at least in my mind, immediately. Now, I don't know where we end up in the regulatory world, but I suspect, and again, listening to Jen and Barbara tends to solidify that in my mind, that we will end up with enough regulatory transparency that OFAC at Treasury will at least be comfortable, especially if it can help set the rules. And on the whole, I'd rather have the Libra Association running the world's, if it turns out to be, in its most ambitious, the world's premier cryptocurrencies than say, the Chinese. Okay, so if we're going to be in a world of 21st century privately run and publicly regulated cryptocurrencies, I'd rather the Americans and the Western consortium get into the game rather than have the Chinese do it and the Russians do it, because they will, I will bet dollars to rubles that the Russians would love to have a system through which they can circumvent the power of the US dollar and circumvent sanctions. I mean, they've been talking about this for years. This is not exactly a secret.
Not the only ones either.
Right. Well, then there's the question of the Europeans and the blowback from our differences over Iran and the JCPOA, which is what I assume you're referring to. And sure. Which means if you're devising, if I were in the US government now and trying to devise a strategic approach to the Libra, I mean, there are sort of three options. Crude. I'm about to be really kind of intellectually crude on this, but three options. Try to kill it because it's new, it's got risks, you just don't like it, it's got a lot of negative baggage, so try to smother it. Or embrace the new, the Silicon Valley post-national paradise. Or obviously, as an old bureaucrat, the third option is the one I'm pushing for, which is a proper regulatory scheme where you throw out the utopian language, which I don't think much of. But you go for the potential, you try to find out whether there is potential value in the Libra, and there's a case that there is, and then make it work. And then you hire a bunch of people like Jen and Barbara to make it work, right? And that means working with the Europeans closely from day one. Because otherwise you will see the Libra or something else it's not intended this way, but it will inadvertently become a wedge. And then imagine a world in which you have competing international private but not government backed, but government regulated competing consortia of cryptocurrencies. The Chinese system, the Chinese-Russian system, the EU system, the US system. I don't like the way that looks. I don't like the way where that takes us. And then you have cryptocurrencies, the Libra, which is designed, if you read the white paper, designed to be a unifying post-national instrument, being the opposite. Not intentional. That's not what I don't think that's what they're after. But that's the way it could end up if we don't approach this in a smart way.
Let me just have a two-finger on that. Dan raises a great point about Europe. And I was remiss in not mentioning it when you asked me about Switzerland. So choosing Switzerland by definition means the Libra Association has affirmatively rejected direct oversight by the European Union and by the United States. And the huge irony there is that the ECB and the precursor to the ECB were the first in modern history, post 1972, to launch a basket currency. The euro didn't just appear in 2000. There was a period in the late 1990s when the precursor to the ECB ran an electronic basket currency of all of the national European currencies for quite some time. So there's a lot of experience, concrete, practical experience buried in the ECB in how to do this. At a point in time today when the euro area is, I think, legitimately feeling very threatened, not just by low economic growth, but also by the Brexit situation. European policymakers and Americans, I think, share a lot of the same values, and they share a lot of the same interests in the stability of the financial system. So there should be lots of places where the policymakers can work together. And in addition, as I mentioned earlier, in Europe, they are on board the instant payment train already, officially. The euro is is launched already an instant payment system. So there are pockets of opportunity for the entire system to be moved forward based on the competition provided by Libra. But I should hope that a precondition to any of that kind of positive engagement would also be some kind of positive engagement by not just Libra, but all the cryptocurrency issuers with respect to the FATF standards.
Thank you. Before I turn it to the audience for a question, I wanted to turn the discussion on its head a little bit and ask all three of you to comment on the following. So that for global growth prospects, financial inclusion is good. There's a lot of people with cell phones and a lot of unbanked people. And one of the risks that we run in having a panel like this that immediately identifies all the regulatory angles and the way this can be controlled and boxed in and managed is the way we have gone with the banks, who de-risk in a lot of jurisdictions, because a big global bank will say, well, here's a small Central American country where I make about $250,000 a year, and it costs me the same to have a compliance officer down there, so why bother? They pull out, and as a result, big parts of the world remain underbanked or unbanked. So I was hoping, there is this promise of harnessing this financial innovation. I was hoping each one of you might make a brief, let's say, a comment about the best case scenario. Maybe I'll start with you, Jen.
On the financial inclusion?
Yeah.
Well, I mean, the interesting, there's a separate sort of but related issue here around, I think, digital identification, and that's another thing that FATF is doing some work on. And it's, financial inclusion in some ways really is about the identification issue and bringing people in, and what's required, what are the standards, and what are the obstacles to bringing them into financial services, and how can you facilitate that. And so there's an interesting sort of potential on digital ID, and again, that might be innovated in this new initiative. It might be an innovation that's somewhere else, but it's also something that regulators are trying to figure out, and what forms of ID, on how you bring data together. Now, clearly that raises the privacy issues, but it's an interesting angle, I think, on the financial inclusion issue.
Dan?
Best case. I mean, what's the equivalent of the lighter regulatory system that can do what the cell phone did a generation ago? Right? Cell phones replaced often state-run, heavy, inefficient, corrupt telephone systems. I mean, I remember, the communist world when cell phones came in, and the first people to grab them in Poland were Polish small farmers out in the countryside. People, they had horses, they plowed with horses, and they got cell phones because they understood instantly that this was a best case solution for them. So that's the promise of the, you see where I'm headed with that analogy. That's the best case. Can you limit the corruption and the bad actors? Can you deal with the money laundering questions and open it up? Possibly. I mean, I don't know. I mean, this is the challenge, and I wish the white paper had been, it felt like it was written by a public relations arm, because it didn't dive into these issues in a way that I think would have made the case stronger, because I think there is a case to be made. But I think the regulatory discussions are about to begin. I think that some of the rules of banking are going to have to apply. Look, I am not a Treasury veteran, but I was reading that the Libra Association will park the assets it receives, the deposits from people, in short-term government securities and in other investment-grade instruments. They're going to pay for the whole system using the interest from those investments. So that means your wallet with the Libra earns you 0%, right? How's that going to play out? How popular is that going to be? So I think there are a lot of tough regulatory questions that need to be answered. But I think that it may not be a null set at the end. Mm-hmm. And I think keeping an open mind and working through the issues is important to see what's left at the other end. And I think there's a chance there could be something good.
Thank you, Dan. Barbara?
So I agree with Jen about the prospect for there to be a significant business model for banks and serving as the authentication gateway of the authentication of identity and the gateway into the payment system. PayPal, Visa, MasterCard, they all do Western Union. They do a phenomenal job in a lot of low-value, high-frequency transactions, and they already do a lot in promoting financial inclusion. But on the other side of it, I think there is much less that is clear about the other half of financial inclusion. So there's access to the payment system, the ability to provide a payment without having to have an exorbitant interest rate. But it's important to note that nobody is going to be giving away cryptocurrency for free. So financial inclusion doesn't automatically make people richer. It just makes more efficient their ability to transfer their resources from to a service provider. So some of the language around financial inclusion, I think, is a little oversold. If you really want to increase wealth, that means you really need to get into the intermediation. And that is a part of the white paper that I personally found quite disappointing. Because if the idea is that Libra is actually going to take deposits, which is a classic definition of a bank, the classic use of a deposit in the economic system is to fund loans to companies that create jobs and create products and create economic growth. And instead, they're going to be using those funds, they say, to invest in the very governments that they say they want independence from. And so it's not clear to me how this generates economic growth. It's not clear to me how it creates jobs. It's not clear to me, I would have thought that with the World Bank's experience in microfinance, there would be a natural play here to finance small businesses worldwide. But I didn't really, now maybe I missed it. Maybe there was a nuance in the paper. Maybe there's more that's going to come out. I don't know. But if you really want to talk about financial inclusion, my view is you can't just talk about efficiency of payments. You've got to talk about economic growth. And that means lending, not cash outlays.
And once you get I agree with that. And that raises a whole other set of questions. Then are we going to be in a situation where the Libra is not back 1-to-1? They say it is. Now that is a highly, I don't know whether regressive is the right word.
Hold a peg. It is, history tells us it
Exactly.
is really hard to hold a peg.
Okay, and I doubt human behavior has changed. I mean, I don't want to be too rough. The world's first cryptocurrency was in the 17th century. It was the Dutch tulip, right? That was also the first sort of financial crash in early modern Europe, famously. But if the Libra Association does, as the white paper says, have every dollar or dollar equivalent of Libra purchases parked away in government and investment grade securities, does that dry up investment capital? What are the implications? Or is it going to have reserve margins? And who's going to set those? Okay? Again, quoting Madison, about human behavior, imperfection of human beings. Right, the regulators are going to have to look at this, and I expect that once we get through the hearings next week, which I suspect will be hot, that there will come a period of time of serious work. And that's when we'll find out. It's after the hearings, when people have staked out initial positions, then we're going to find out what's left at the other end, when all these questions have to be answered.
Thank you. Let me open it up to the audience for Josh, right here at the front. And please state your name and affiliation. So we know
Josh Rudolph with the Alliance for Securing Democracy. Thank you all for being here and doing this timely event. As I listen and learn from each of your insights, Barbara, on the decades that it took to break Swiss bank secrecy, and that's still obviously a project, and Dan on the third option, making it work within a proper regulatory structure. Jenna on the trade-off between innovation and risk. It makes me wonder whether the solution will have to involve telling Facebook now, before the cat is out of the U.S. regulatory bag and burrowed into the haven of Swiss secrecy, telling them, you can do it, but it's going to be made in America. Trump will love this, right? Forget about doing it in Switzerland, not for commercial reasons, but because we need, regulatory control for enforcement, for monetary policy control reasons. We need the ability to be able to control it. What would turn on that distinction, and would you recommend looking in that direction?
Jen?
Well, I guess sort of my understanding of the situation, and this is sort of the issue that I mentioned earlier, is that if you're a wallet in cryptocurrency and you're operating in a jurisdiction, you may be registered or whatever in Switzerland, but if you're operating in the United States, I mean, you've got to comply with U.S. regulations. So it's, to me, it's that we already have that expectation that if you're operating in the United States, you've got to comply. So I don't know about the really being able to avoid that just by being in a different country as sort of a headquarters matter. So others might have different views on this.
Well, yeah, not only do I agree, I think it's a question of how the message is delivered, because I think once you've got a minimum contact and you've got users in the financial system in the United States and you've got some interaction with the financial system, whether it's in the securities markets or the payment system, the jurisdiction is pretty clear. When I'm not here at the Atlantic Council, I'm also running a little technology startup, and so I know tell you a little bit about the technology universe. My impression is telling anybody that works in technology at any level, you must do this, is really the wrong way to get anyone on board with anything. I think it's far more effective to highlight commonalities of interest and appeal to what Lincoln referred to as the better angels of our nature, than to exert direct authority.
Dan, any comments on that? Or?
Look, the search for the regulatory middle ground is easier said than done. And I find it'll be interesting to see how this administration goes forward, because national sovereignty is one of the kind of foundations of the Trump administration's approach to the international system. Well, in this case, international sovereignty with respect to the Libra either means embedding it in a regulatory framework, or doesn't mean anything. But of course, government regulation is also not, it's also anathema to some parts of the American political spectrum. So we're going to have to see how they sort this out.
It's not like they're going to be unregulated, because they are going to be in Switzerland. So I'm sure that plenty of people right now are digging up every MOU that the United States and the European Union have ever executed with Switzerland in securities and banking.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and I want to foot on something Barbara said earlier. Decentralized forms of government is one of the white paper's stated goals for the Libra. Well, no, there's nothing decentralized about a consortium of corporations. Okay? That's out of government hands, it's in somebody else's hands. I think what would Elizabeth Warren make it? She'd make a meal of that phrase. Governance is not decentral. I don't know what decentralized forms of governance means. Governance means you have rules that the Libra must adhere to. Now those rules need to be set. It can be set in a consultative fashion, and these can be commonly understood rules. You could have G7 or US-EU working together to set up guidelines, but in the end it's going to be national regulators or EU or the EU Commission. And I don't know that the Libra consortium is going to Switzerland to evade US and EU regulation, because if they think they can, they are badly informed. Jen's right, and imagine the conversation when the EU and US go to the Swiss for a full and frank discussion. Okay, so we're going to be in the regulatory space.
Thank you. Gentleman in the back there.
Thank you, Rob Tobias, and I'm currently with the National Association of Beverage Importers as an alcohol after 34 years with Treasury. Maybe 34 years the Treasury drives you to alcohol, I'm not sure. Thank you, fascinating discussion. Really, I had one, but now I have two questions. First, with respect to your comments about investing in the state instruments, I mean, indirectly, that would seem to me it just means the government does the spending instead of the private industry. When you buy government instruments, you're basically giving governments money to spend, so I assume it creates some economic growth, though maybe not the most efficient. But my real question is, and looking at it with respect to my members who deal with international transactions, how do you deal with the situation when a company overseas you're dealing with demands that you use Libra or some other currency? I mean, right now I see my members coming to me saying, hey, I have this great deal, but they want to use this form of payment. And so it's not something we can walk away from by saying, I don't like it, I don't want to deal with it. I mean, can you build a system that puts some sort of optional nature to it, or is that just the business world and tough whatever? Thank you.
Well, I think that was the point I made a little earlier, with that we're about to see real competition. The fact is that people in the Western tradition, people are sovereign, and they choose, traditionally by voting, but there are other risks there, currently with technology, but they choose by voting what they want in their government and what they want their government to do. And a government can say, this is legal tender, but you can look at Zimbabwe, you can look at Venezuela. There comes a point when people start saying, hold on, we don't buy that. Literally, don't buy that. And traditionally, they have chosen to buy dollars or euros. And now I think it's a legitimate competition. I don't know how that sorts out, but I also don't believe it's either useful or effective for a government to say, well, you cannot do this. Because our entire tradition from the Enlightenment to today, this particular nation is founded on the principle that individuals are sovereign. You just can't do that. If an individual says, not for me, I want to go over here, I don't think that you've got much of a choice. It's up to the central banks, the governments, to become competitive, to evolve and become a compelling, reliable source of stability and trust. And if they don't have that, they've got nothing.
Maybe just one follow-up to that. I apologize for monopolizing questions, but what I do see in Washington is people turn to the government when they can't succeed in some of the negotiations and make the government say, well, I prohibit transactions in this country with that currency. That's what I see industry frequently doing when they don't want to do something. They find a way to get the government to issue regulation to restrict its use. So, sorry guys, it's not my it's not my fault. I wanted to, but I can't.
Competition takes many forms, and that includes regulatory arbitrage.
I do think in response to your question is on it's not something I've fully explored, but in the short term, a hurdle, not for big beverage importers, but for smaller companies like mom and pop shops, is you have to run all these simultaneous payment systems, right? If you're a shop owner in Kenya, suddenly there's cash, there's someone with a cell phone, there's credit cards. There's some hurdle and some ramp to overcome here because why is a shop owner incentivized to run all these simultaneous forms of accepting payment? So it has to be disproportionately easier to use the Libra with a cell phone for it to be worth it for smaller companies. Yeah, sir, here in the front.
Ed Verona with Trident Acquisitions Corporation, but the question is really of personal interest. Something you haven't touched upon are some of the more technical aspects of a cryptocurrency. The huge amounts of energy required to generate the blockchains that are the basis for it, which raises a question about regulation of data transmission lines, about where the servers are located, may raise questions about CO2 emissions, maybe a competition between those countries that are the lowest cost energy producers, regardless of whether it's done in a sustainable manner or not. Can you address those questions and see how that would fit into a regulatory framework?
These are live issues right now. I mean, there are stories of Bitcoin miners flocking to the Columbia River Valley so that they can effectively co-locate to hydropower. There are, I don't remember where I saw it, but in the last month I saw some activists were becoming very anti-crypto because of the tremendous computing power that's required. They were saying, hold on, crypto is not green. And which, the politics of that by itself are just mind-boggling. But there are very significant issues there. There are very significant data localization initiatives by governments for other reasons that have nothing to do with protecting fiat currency, but have everything to do with the ability of a government to operate the economy responsibly. The other thing that we haven't talked about is that if you have a fair amount of economic activity occurring on a blockchain where the information is not available to a finance ministry and to a central bank, how do you manage fiscal policy? How do you manage monetary policy if you don't even know where supply and demand are flowing? The green issues, I think, haven't even really hit the mainstream yet in the crypto world, but they will. And I think those are issues that they have to find a way of addressing.
Yeah, I think there's an underexplored regulatory angle as well, as I mentioned this earlier, as a forcing mechanism for regulation of cryptocurrency, rather than debate whether the currency itself is a commodity or an asset or a security. You just say it travels across a network and we'll regulate it as a network. So if I were a government with access to significant hydropower, like the Quebec government, and I were interested in regulating cryptocurrencies, I would get into the mining business, at least selectively, and have access to the information and see what all is going on. And I have to think or hope that some governments are already doing that. Yes, sir.
Hi, my name is Jeremy Luma from Arizona State University, and I work in the blockchain research lab. To touch on his question quickly, I think the energy issue is a specific cryptocurrency issue based on the algorithms those specific currencies use. Libra is not one of those currencies that use a mining algorithm like that, so we don't have to worry about that one specifically for Libra, but it could be a general like cryptocurrency issue we should look at. My question for the panel, though, is agree or disagree. From my perspective, all of this about this topic currently is a big narrative push from both ends. Facebook's end is, the financial inclusion, banking the unbanked, et cetera. The regulatory end is, AML, terrorist financing, financial stability, volatility, et cetera. But I think I think both sides are strategically tiptoeing around the crux of the topic, which is, a currency that is attempting to go beyond any specific nation state. And from my perspective, I don't see governments. I see it, with your three options. I see governments going and attempting to smother it as much as possible until they can completely smother it. We already see that with certain countries doing that. But at the same time, I feel like, we all know technology. It's a borderless thing. If one country stopped it in their country, there's another country that'll let it happen in their country, and they'll keep it going. So do you guys also see this as kind of just a big narrative push to try to win over the public masses currently right now? Because in my opinion, they're the ones who are going to truly decide the future of where this goes. Right? If the majority of people realize that they want to go a more decentralized route, there's not too much any specific country can do. But if the countries are able to sell the narrative of why they should stay with nation-state currencies, there's not too much that a tech company can really push that. Like, am I the only one who's like reading between the lines here and sees that as like the main topic of this discussion, or do you guys simply think it's the narratives that both sides are pushing that's like the main stuff?
That's a big and interesting question. I'm getting at the edge, or probably beyond the edge, of my area of expertise. But I don't see the Libra or any cryptocurrency as a genuine currency like the dollar, the euro, the pound, because it rests either, if it's the Bitcoin, it's, pardon me, a 21st century version of the tulip in the 17th century Dutch Republic. It's got no intrinsic value, it's purely speculative, and good luck to you. The Libra is different. I mean, if it comes out, if it ends up existing, it will be different because it will be tied to a basket of currencies. But that basket of currencies will be the repository of genuine value, and so the Libra becomes an accounting and transferability mechanism. So that doesn't mean you're wrong. I think some governments may genuinely want to smother it just because of issues of sovereignty and it's novel. I get that. But I don't see the Libra as being a genuine currency of value because its value is derivative solely. I mean, otherwise, the confidence you have in it is the confidence that you can at any time dump your Libra and get back your dollars or euros or whatever you invested in. I think your other point about the push of narratives is actually right. I was struck reading the white paper by a narrative being the post-national narrative being pushed. Decentralization, open a global open instant global currency. And that's exactly the kind of narrative I used to hear before before digital disinformation became a problem. I mean, this is pre-2016 talk. And now, of course, the social media companies say they're for regulation. And I actually believe them, I bet they are, because it's safety. But I think that narrative is being pushed, and I regard that narrative with obviously a certain skepticism. I think the other side of the narrative, I think Jen is right to point out that money laundering, criminality, terrorist finance is going to be everywhere. It's not unique to cryptocurrencies, right? That's not a reason to necessarily, the danger of infiltration of cryptocurrencies is not a reason that cryptocurrencies are invalid. Then the question is what regulatory structures can be applied to mitigate that risk. That's Jen's point. So I'll defend, the middle ground option, though I think the Libra white paper is going to have to be superseded by something a lot more serious.
Anyone familiar with Richard Thaler's Nobel Prize-winning work, commonly referred to as nudge economics, recognizes an effort to generate a narrative where people follow, fill in the blank, sheep, lemmings, whatever. So that behavior exists, and it has existed for a long time. It did not originate with Silicon Valley. It didn't originate with social media. That does not necessarily mean that the binary structure you suggested is in play. I do not see how the United States or the European Union can, quote unquote, crush Libra or any other cryptocurrency. The United States did not campaign to become the global reserve currency. And it just didn't. And if it had to do that, it wouldn't happen. The European Union launched its own cryptocurrency before it launched the euro as a test case, did it successfully. They campaign a little bit more because they're a little bit newer and they are the quote unquote challenger. There's a geopolitical component to that. But I don't see how, having done it themselves, European policymakers can quote unquote seek to crush a cryptocurrency. And there is, this is all about a battle for trust. And the huge irony, of course, is that Facebook at present, it's not rating very high on the trust meter for a lot of reasons. So, I view this as a battle for trust, and that's really what the narrative is. And part of the trust battle is preserving the safety of the system from criminals.
Okay, we have time for one or two more questions. Gentleman in the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. To follow on Barbara Matthews' point just there, I use cash and nobody knows I'm anonymous. If I use my credit cards, a company or companies know something about my preferences and where I've been. As long as I don't commit crimes, I'm pretty anonymous. What are the unbanked going to have to give up in terms of information to participate in Libra? Facebook wants to expand and preserve its moat to be a hugely profitable company. What does the company envision it's going to gain from all of this information?
Well, I don't know what the company is going to do, but wearing my hat as a former Treasury official, my gut instinct is that, well, they're going to have to start paying taxes, or at least file tax returns and maybe get a refund. I don't know. That was not clear in the white paper, and I don't know anyone involved in the project, so I can't really comment.
Yeah, Facebook will run the wallet app, right, as it's envisioned at the moment. So as it's envisioned, you can start with Libra using a fake Facebook account, but if you are using a Facebook app that's similar to Messenger for your wallet, Facebook learns about your customer preferences and can do more targeted advertising. So it's potentially highly profitable for Facebook. Yeah, right here.
Thank you. Michael Stetcher, Center for the Study of the Presidency. This is mostly a question for Jen. One of the issues that was just alluded to is that you could, in theory, set up a Libra wallet with a fake Facebook account. At what level of the Libra ecosystem would know your client, know your customer, anti-money laundering requirements attach? Would they attach at the Facebook level or at the subsidiary level?
It's a good, I don't know that we know enough to know, but from the way that we've looked at it in the past, it has to do with the intersection with the sort of banking system, so it's the wallets, right? But I have seen, so FATF has done some work and the US has done some work to sort of extend the definition of what is covered beyond, I think, wallets in a way. I think the FATF language on the definition there is a little broader about sort of being involved in the movement of value. But if you think about it in the wallet case, then that's the point of entry, right? So it makes sense, the customer due diligence. But I can't be definitive about that. And that's my point about the question about identity and information, the potential innovation there around digital ID. It's all very, there's a potential for a lot of innovation there when you couple that with these requirements from FATF or expectations from FATF around having on hand wallets or other what they call virtual asset service providers, having the information about the originator, information about the beneficiary, sort of the transactional information, being able to provide that forward into governments if needed. So it's a good question. I think that's sort of, we'll have to see how that plays out.
Okay. Yeah, one more question, sir. Here.
Alex Tansey with Bloomberg News. How much work has been done on the composition of the basket? And have the currencies been determined? Have weights been assigned?
I think the only thing we've got is what's in the white paper,
So,
which isn't sufficient to answer that question. And then compare that with everything the IMF puts out. If you just do a side-by-side, which I actually have done, you do a side-by-side, there's a universe of additional information we need in order to answer that question.
That's one of the easier problems to solve. I mean, it's relatively straightforward. I mean, there are a whole lot of other questions about the investment, the regulation of the investment, the reserve requirements. All of these issues are going to have to be teased out. Again, the white paper was an initial press release. It's not an analysis that's going to convince people.
I mean, I imagine there's going to be quite a bit of pressure on some currencies to be elevated more than they are in the SDR. That would just be my personal opinion. But,
Yeah, probably.
Okay. Well, thank you all for. We've talked about financial regulation. We've quoted the Federalist Papers, and Dan Fried has brought up Russia. So your morning is already complete, and it's only 10:30. Thank you all for joining.